Teachers of Reddit, have you ever had a crush on a student? And if so, how did you feel about yourself? I used to teach entry-level programming at an art school to undergrads, and later at the graduate level. It happened all the freaking time, but I never felt bad about it, because they were adults and I was the same age. Obviously, I couldn't act on anything as a matter of policy, and I certainly didn't let it affect my grading, but god dang it was difficult, especially with the two instances where I could tell it was mutual. Or maybe it wasn't and they just wanted better grades, I don't know. They both got C's regardless. Edit. I get it. D jokes. My dad was my mom's professor in university. They got married. The marriage didn't go well. I am the result of what happens when people try to save a relationship by having a baby. College professor here. I get a lot of gorgeous students, but the attraction usually lasts as long as it takes them to open their mouths. What can I say? When you're in your 30s, 18 to 22-year-olds suddenly seem very shallow and immature to you. Trust me, you will come to think the same way. But then, I had a student who was not only stunningly beautiful, but also very mature beyond her years, and she had a lot of similar interests to me. And what's better, because she was new to America from England, she was also a bit lost and confused, and I told her she could come to me whenever she wanted if she needed advice and guidance. She did for a while, but I never did anything but just talk with her. As attracted as I was to her, trying to make a move would have been a very tricky thing because student-teacher relationships are very taboo. The thing is, though, as she adjusted to America, she started coming by less often because she didn't really need our talks anymore. After the class was over, I hardly ever ran into her anymore, so the opportunity just never presented itself. I look back on it now as a for the best thing. Even if she had been interested in me, and I don't think she was, I'm quite used to my students, even the more mature ones, automatically seeing me as an old geezer, even though I'm 31 now and this was a couple years ago. If I'd had a relationship with her and we'd been caught, it could have potentially been the end of my career, or at the very least, it would have gotten me in a lot of hot water. But I also found that shortly after the class ended and I stopped seeing her with any frequency, that she fell out of my thoughts too, and I went back to being interested in women my own age who are preferably not my students. I'm actually glad that it doesn't bother me anymore because I feel like it would be beyond pathetic for someone like me to be so hopelessly in love with a student. I'm 22 and have a senior, so I'd assume 17 or 18, piano student who I most certainly don't have romantic or sexual feelings for. Honestly, the student-teacher barrier comes pretty naturally to me. But I remember after her first lesson being very intrigued/stricken by the fact that she reminds me so much of myself as a high school senior. Same sort of aspirations and motivation, or rather lack thereof for anything that isn't music, that I had at her age. Same sort of unusual taste in music, same dry and sarcastic sense of humor. She's even got a lot of the same weaknesses that I did before going to conservatory, most notably scales, sight reading, and jazz voicings. I don't like her, but I'm fairly certain that high school me would have been all over her. Not me personally, but had a guy that graduated my year 2012, secretly dating our student teacher for AP English in 12th grade. Not a huge thing, she was 4 years older. They started dating 2 weeks into the school year that year, and he got her pregnant. They got married last June. It was a very weird situation for all of us that knew, as she was very open with the girls in the class when our main teacher was out for a few days. Once had a very, very attractive student teacher in my senior year. She was 24, I was 18. A ton of the other students were talking about how bad they wanted to screw her. I became pretty good friends with her. We read similar books, listened to similar music, and one day she asked me for a ride home because her car wasn't working. I drove her to her house and she invited me inside. After talking for about an hour, we went into the bedroom and screwed. We kept it secret from everybody, and after I graduated, we began a stable relationship. We dated for about 2 years until she moved to Washington. I would say she had a crush on me. I teach kindergarten, voice actor's note, bear with me here, so I don't exactly get crushes on my students. But as a person that doesn't want any kids themselves, there are a few kids, maybe 1 in 40, where I can't help myself from thinking I'd adopt the crap out of you if you didn't have any parents. It takes a special kid to bring out my paternal instinct. I would bang the majority of the moms, though. I think a lot of people underestimate the amount of influence you have as a young, in your 20s, and successful teacher over high school-age kids. I don't know how to say this, but you kind of get a free in as the young teacher because they can't relate to the more veteran teachers. The kids see a somewhat idealized version of you, and if you wanted to, it is quite easy to take advantage of that trust. This is why teacher-student relationships are avoided by teachers, because it's hard to tell what's real and what is a byproduct of that special mentor relationship. If you think your student is the one or something, just keep in touch and hit them up when they're an adult, mentally, not when they hit 18 and graduate. I was a teacher's assistant for a drawing class for a couple of semesters. It was the sort of TA position where the professor would hand you the outline for the semester and you'd teach one of his classes. There was this one girl that looked like a sort of Persian goddess, and she was freaking talented, which drew me to her even more. We got to the part of the class where we started doing portraits. I'd take volunteers from the class and we'd all draw them. I would bounce between critiquing students' work and doing the portrait myself because observing is a great way to learn. The first few went very well. I was on my teaching game and my portraits were up to my standards. Being a good sport, I'd give it to the model when they were done. The first one asked for theirs, and it just sort of became a thing. Then she came up. The thing about drawing is you have to be able to ignore your brain's preconceived ideas of what you are looking at and dissect the visual information analytically. I found her so beautiful for the first time in my life, I could not do this. I drew, I erased, I drew, I erased. I wasn't bouncing around as much as I had been because I was so frustrated that I could not draw the one person in the class I wanted to draw. We finished, and it turned out okay. Not great, just okay. I still gave it to her, but I was honestly ashamed of it. At the end of the last portrait class, one of the models asked how they'd done. This led to a discussion on how they'd all done. Persian Goddess asked me the inevitable question. I told her she was difficult to draw. She asked why. I immediately regretted my initial response. I think I said something about her features being unusual or something cringeworthy. I wanted to tell her she was too beautiful, but I couldn't. If you're reading this, Persian Goddess, I'm sorry. I should have told you that you were gorgeous. This may not exactly count, but some years ago, I taught English in Japan. I'm a woman, and I taught an older female student at our house. Sorry, Reddit, no going where you think. She was quite nice, and one day she asked me to teach a lesson for her son, who was in high school. I agreed. I just came at the usual time and did the lesson with him instead of her. Well, he was a senior in high school. I was in my late 20s, and I thought he was adorable. I don't really feel guilty. My thoughts didn't even begin to approach the sexual side of a crush. I just thought he was cute and sweet. But he definitely had a bit of a crush on me, and our mutual appreciation was probably noticed by the mom. So here is where it gets hilarious. Next week, I come to teach the mom again, and we do the usual introductory conversation at the beginning of the lesson. It was during the rainy season, so I said to her that I missed the sun. She looked very confused for a minute, so I pointed up towards the sky to try and mime what I was talking about. We were in the first floor of her house, and I'm pretty sure I was pointing upstairs to her son's room, so she continued to misinterpret my English. It took me a minute to realize why she had this upset look on her face, and I don't think I was able to save her from her thoughts. After that day, she canceled the class, and I never saw either of them again. As this is not a throwaway, let me restate that I never crossed any lines with their son, even in the privacy of my mind, so I don't really feel bad about the whole thing, but I thought my story might amuse Reddit. Imagine having your relationship be over the intricacies of the English language. And I can only feel bad for the older female student because she couldn't exactly ask her if she meant the giant flaming ball in the sky or her progeny just chilling on the floor right above them. I taught a large lecture class at university level for a number of years. My department head clearly stated that hanky-panky with students was a fireable offense. There were opportunities, but I did not pursue. One situation, though not directly pertinent, stands out. When lecturing, I paid close attention to student reactions. In larger classes, I tended to settle on certain students for my repeated sampling. If they seemed to understand what I was talking about, things were okay. During one lecture on some fairly complex ideas, I had included, among other students, one beautiful co-ed. Until that day, I knew she was beautiful and appreciated her for that, but nothing more. Each time I spot checked, she was paying rapt attention, eyes wide, full of excitement at the knowledge I was dispensing. I was falling in love during my lecture. Such beauty, and she was enthralled with the topic that I totally loved. I required students to do a journal at the end of each class. She obviously had no clue as to what I was talking about. I was deeply puzzled. She had been right there at every point. Later in the semester, I went to a men's basketball game. She was a cheerleader, and one of the prime ones at that. Even while our team was being embarrassed by the visitors, the cheerleaders kept doing their job as if the fans' excitement would make a difference in this lost cause. And she was one of their leaders, eyes wide, showing the same excitement and verve that I had interpreted as her interest in my lecture. I learned a life lesson that day. As someone who has trouble understanding social cues and facial expressions sometimes, I can definitely relate to this. It's hard to know if somebody's face is just being naturally expressive or if they're showing a genuine interest in you. Back in 8th grade, I had this young, super attractive teacher for history. Don't know how old she was, but she had only been teaching for 1 year and was recently married, so my guess was 23 to 24. Anyway, one day I go to her desk to ask her something, and she was standing and leans forward to show me in the book what I need to read/look at. Well, I missed everything she was saying because holy heck, I could see right down her shirt, and those knockers had 8th grade me captured. I was totally zoned out just looking and looking. At some point, she stopped talking and noticed what I was doing and just smiled and was looking at me, never stood up or covered up. Our eyes met, and she just smiled, winked, and then sent me on my way. The rest of the year was kind of flirty, but she never tried anything. Fast forward 12 to 13 years, and one day randomly on Facebook, I get a friend request from her. Haven't spoke to her since I left the 8th grade. No idea why she added me. Thought, well, maybe she adds all the kids she taught. Well, despite my graduating class having over 1,000 kids, we had no mutual friends. So I waited a while to accept it and then eventually did. Still no friends that were in my grade. Finally, I got creeped out and deleted her. Still have no idea why she did that. Makes me wonder if there was something more behind that. I'm gonna be honest, that dude dodged a bullet. If your teacher's trying to start something with you in 8th grade, that's a red flag right there. I'm surprised nobody got called. I work at an expensive school that teaches 4 to 7-year-olds. A few of my students have moms with husbands that work 80-hour weeks and become very interested in me. One in particular sent her daughter to school with skincare products. Cool? Chocolates, and wine on different occasions. She kept trying to hang out with me outside of school and wanting pictures of me and her daughter together. When she finally got the message that it wasn't happening, she pulled her daughter out of my class and had her quit the school. It was weird. When I was teaching high school level students, it was the reverse. A student had a crush on me. It made things awkward because a few others sensed it. Thankfully, by being consistent and not returning any signs of interest over time, it eventually cooled down and resolved. What's interesting, though, is that most think it's always the teacher having feelings for a student, when sometimes it's the opposite, and it places the teacher in a very uncomfortable, difficult position. If you ask me, it comes down to being professional. You're here to teach, not screw around with other kids. And if you're more focused on your students in that way rather than teaching them for the benefit of their health and the developing mind, then it's not going to help anyone in the long run. It even has the chance to irreparably damage your career. Basically, don't screw kids, it's that simple. Kind of reversed, but when I was in high school, I had a Spanish class that I was very advanced in, given the material. The teacher would often tutor me directly, and things seemingly got a bit flirty sometimes. We ended up actually hooking up one day after class. Homeschool was weird. Not a teacher, but when I was 22, I was the receptionist at a film school, university level, and had quite a flirty relationship with a few of the students, very male-oriented subject, and quite a few attractive ones. I ended up secretly going out with one of the students for 18 months. I would have lost my job if that had gotten out. I teach tutorials at university as a final year grad student. A student, who yes, I did find attractive, hit on me after our last tutorial, asking me out for coffee. I, with some reluctance because he was cute, for context, I am also a guy, politely told him I'd be very busy the rest of the term, but he was welcome to email me next year to keep in touch if he wished. That would be fine. He got the hint. No cute first year is worth throwing away the potential of an academic career. Also, our TA handbook has no rules for this sort of thing, and it really should. Never! The very thought makes me want to shower. Students are children, even the high schoolers. Yeah, I gave that one a funny voice, but seriously, don't screw kids. It's bad. Okay, thanks. Boring answer. I can safely say that I have taught some very attractive young women, but I've never been sexually interested. I mean, they are teenagers. What are they bringing to the party? Enthusiasm? I mean, they are like puppies. Cute, lots of energy, and no training. Sorry, I stopped shopping on the girls' floor immediately after I figured out where the women's department was. That's about the best way I could ever have heard someone put it. Not a teacher, but I have a story that's really odd. He was our grade 9 homeroom teacher. Let's call him Mr. Nee. Mr. Nee was married, had 2 kids and a darling wife who was a counselor at another school. A lot of people liked him, but he was known to choose favorites and non-favorites. I was a definite non-favorite, so I don't really have any kind words to say about him, but I digress. There was this one guy in our class. Let's call him Ev. Ev was a typical wannabe gangster kid, from the saggy jeans to the DC lid. He was actually a really nice guy, but had an attitude at the same time. Me and him have talked once in a while since finishing high school, and he seems to be doing well with his new girlfriend and job. But again, I digress. Remember how I said Mr. Nee had favorites? Well, let's just say the way he treated his favorites looked like crap compared to how well he treated Ev. Ev practically could do anything in that class while everyone else had limits, even the favorites. Ev could come in late to class, not answer questions, and eat and drink whenever he wanted in class. But the one thing I'll never forget is how Mr. Nee would look at Ev occasionally as the class worked on an assignment or test. I really wish I had a picture, then you would probably understand where I'm going with this. It was pretty obvious to the majority of the class Mr. Nee had a thing for Ev, but as you can probably guess, it never went farther than the awkward glance and smile. Ev was completely oblivious to all of this, as he was just happy to have a free class without worry. Who wouldn't be? Mr. Nee still works at my junior high, and sadly, I do run into him a lot on my walks to and from certain places. I'll never know for a fact what Mr. Nee's fixation on Ev was, and it's probably better I don't know. I would just like to know this was just his way of being very nice to a student and nothing else. I used to teach college, and once in every few classes there'd be a really attractive woman, an adult in her early 20s, but a student. Thing being, after 2 or 3 classes, I'd realize I had no attraction to her at all because she just seemed so immature and naive. I don't mean that to sound mean, but I'm attracted to people who have as much life experience as I do or more. So, much younger people just entering college might look very attractive and might indeed even be very intelligent, but their sense of what the world was based on cumulative experience seemed fairly limited. So I basically stopped being more than idly attracted to them, the way you'd be when you passed a pretty woman in your office. There was never any real attraction at all. I'm a student, but I have a story I had with my female teacher. I had a teacher who was very attractive. She was 25 years old, blonde, witty, funny, and was also the volleyball coach. She began to drive me to school because she taught there. We lived in the same neighborhood, and I was also one of her favorite students the year before. Not because of great grades or anything. Actually, the opposite. Because I always screwed around in the class and made teaching, quote, fun and exciting for her. Her words, by the way. I also babysat her daughter, and her daughter loved me, so I had that going for me as well. Well, every morning before she took me, her husband, who worked as a garbage man, would be out working and her daughter was usually asleep, so we were alone most of the time. One day, as I watched her daughter and waited for her to get ready, she called from her room and told me to heat up the car and put her daughter outside. As I waited in the car for a while, I was getting pretty bored since her daughter was asleep and I went in to see if she needed any help. Well, I walked in and saw her walking from the bathroom to her bedroom completely topless and she locked eyes with me. I jokingly said, "Whoa, praise freaking Jesus," and did the triangle motion prayer thing and pointed towards the sky. She laughed as she walked back into her room. After this moment, she always seemed to be more flirtatious. She would talk closer to my face, held strong eye contact very often, and even started touching my leg. I reciprocated by also being flirty. I eventually switched schools at the end of the year, and we haven't had any contact since. Just recently, I had to get a recommendation letter for my applications, so I thought who better to ask than my favorite teacher, so I went over to her home. Her daughter had grown so much, and I've never seen a child so happy to see me. I sat down beside my teacher in the kitchen, and we talked for a long time, catching up on things. She said stuff like, "You've grown so much, and I missed you," which seemed mutual because I also missed talking to her. As her daughter watched TV, my teacher did the leg-touching thing again as she whispered about how she was a virgin until college, where she met her husband. She also said that her class is so freaking boring since I left, which I didn't think was completely true. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but I was rock hard and she noticed. She said praise Jesus and we both laughed. Then, she grabbed it through my pants. It stopped suddenly when her daughter came up and asked to play with me, so I agreed and I played with her as my teacher wrote the letter of recommendation. After a few hours, I hugged her and her daughter and left the house with an empty feeling. I feel like I could have completed my high school fantasy, but I decided not to that day, mostly because of the fact that she had a husband I respected, and I know I would be really freaking mad if I had a wife who had sex with another person, mostly with a high school student. However, if stuff ever goes wrong with the husband, I will mostly try again. We love a mature person who won't interfere with the married relationship. My 6th grade teacher had a crush on the student teacher that came to help out for a couple months. Although not obvious, they screwed, and he proposed to her in front of the class soon after. They got married and had a kid 2 to 3 years later. For clarity, they screwed outside the bounds of the classroom. The teacher was a total fox as well. I would have loved to park my punch buggy in her garage. Reading that sentence was vile. I work in a school and have never felt this way about a student, but I've known 2 teachers who fell for students, took it too far, and got fired. Each of them were profoundly unhappy people. It seems that's mostly the case for a lot of teacher-student relationships that went south. Outside of abusive power, these relationships start up to fill a void or indulge an empty desire. 9 times out of 10, it was never about true love in the first place. They never end up pretty unless they're consenting adults, and even then, things can end up pretty strained if they're not communicating with each other. I was 24 and she was 17, and I never did anything, but I totally acknowledged to myself that she was very pretty and clever. It made me feel weird, but I didn't sexualize her or anything. It was more a thought that, wow, if I was 7 years younger, I'd totally be into her. Right, we got it, bro. It is one of the most flattering things for an attractive student to take an interest in a subject that you are teaching. She's an undergrad, and you're TAing a subject that you are deeply interested in. Sure, her questions are novice, but she is enthusiastic and curious about your nerdy field in which you basically toil alone. If you make it past the first year without doing anything stupid, the next year you TA the same class, you meet a whole new year of students, and then you realize that there's a whole new crop of attractive young neophytes who bear a striking resemblance to your first crush last year, and that you are probably going to give more or less the same assistance to your students as last year, until you realize that in class you are helping everyone refine their understanding and move on, while you toil with few peers in the same subject that many will superficially take an interest in and move on year after year. Dude, you good? You need some you need some therapy for that little session? My secondary school English teacher had a crush on me. It wasn't obvious, but I saw it. She was a BBW as classed by my friends. We were 14 at the time. I really did sexualize her and imagine sex with her. I would often stare at her thighs and extremely wide hips in class. She would often pick me out to answer questions and was more relaxed with me while a little strict with others, as if we were good friends. She was a good teacher, definitely. Fast forward a few years and I just finished college. I get a Facebook request from my English teacher. I immediately knew why she added me. She was 22 when she worked with us, and that was what I told my brain when I wanted sex with her. We hooked up and had sex. I lived with her for a couple of months and moved out, had more sex, etc. That's it, really. She just waited until I was old enough, and honestly, she gave better head than any of the other girls I was with.